And now this guy, Arch West, was the VP of Sales and Marketing for Frito-Lay. Well, in 1961, Arch West took his family on a trip to Southern California. And he stayed in Orange County at a house belonging to a guy named Lawrence Frank, someone you have probably never heard of, but you have heard of what Lawrence Frank invented. He invented Lawry's seasoned salt. Lawrence Frank also had a restaurant where he served this seasoned salt called the Five Crowns. And one day, Arch West went there for lunch, had his favorite lunch, which was prime rib, and he loved the cream spinach. And as he and his family were walking out, this stranger walked up to them. And he complimented Arch's daughter on her golden, beautiful hair. And they got to talking. And the stranger said, "Oh, have you ever eaten at one of my restaurants?" And they had never heard of this guy's restaurant, even though in a few years' time, this restaurant would open its 500th location. The guy they bumped into was Ray Kroc, who started McDonald's. And I know what you're thinking. Something momentous happened. Something momentous did happen, but it had nothing to do with Ray Kroc. Arch West, a seminal figure in the history of modern food, and Ray Kroc passed almost like ships in the night. The seminal moment that would change Arch West's life, would change my life, and also your life, and everyone's lives, happened a few days later when he was driving to San Diego with his kids, and he passed what his daughter described to me as a little Mexican shack by the side of the road. And this was the kind of place that Arch West just had to stop. He was that kind of guy. And for the first time in his life, he tasted a tortilla chip. And he was amazed. He thought, this is going to be Frito-Lay's next big thing. So he went back to Dallas. He approached the executive team at Frito-Lay, and he told them about his great plan to make tortilla chips the next big thing. And they looked at him and they said, "Are you nuts? We already sell Fritos. Why would we sell tortilla chips? They're the same thing. Fritos are fried pieces of cornmeal. Tortilla chips are fried pieces of tortilla, which was cornmeal. It's just baked. That's the only difference. Tortilla chips are just a bit crunchier than Fritos. And they have a slightly different shape. Apart from that, exactly the same. His executive said, "Dumb idea, go away." And he did go away. And he funneled discretionary funds to an off-site facility, and he developed the tortilla chip concept. He brought it back to them. Now he had a name. Now he had samples. He named them after a pidgin Mexican word for little pieces of gold. He handed out the samples and he said, "Gentlemen, I give you Doritos." And I know what you're thinking. The rest is history. This is the snack that changed America. And you are wrong. This is the snack that bombed. The very first Doritos, as you might be able to see from there, it says toasted corn taste. Nobody got them. In the Southwest, where there was a Hispanic cultural influence, where people knew a tortilla chip was great for dipping into guacamole or a bean dip, people thought they were great. Everywhere else, the complaint was, these things sound Mexican, but they don't taste Mexican. So it was not looking good for our friend Arch West. He had to talk once again to his fellow executives, face them, and they all want to know, what's going on with this miracle snack of yours, these Doritos? Well, this is where Arch West said one of the most important phrases in the last 50 years in the history of food. He said, "Make them taste like taco." He was derided. One of his fellow executives looked at this ad man, this Yankee from New York City, and said, "You don't know the difference between a thing and a flavor." And that guy made a really good point, because up until then, he was right. Things had their own flavors. If you wanted to taste an orange, you had to need an orange. If you wanted to taste an apple, you had to need an apple. And if you wanted the flavor of a taco, you had to eat a taco. Now, we don't know why, but it's probably because of Arch West's relationship with his friend who invented Lawry's seasoned salt. He knew that things had changed, that in fact, you could make something taste like whatever you wanted to taste. And that's why Frito-Lay, a couple of years hence, brought out the taco-flavored Dorito. And this is what changed Doritos. Doritos went from being a snack that no one was interested in eating to a snack that was irresistible, that everybody was interested in eating. After taco became nacho, there was nacho cheese, then there was Cool Ranch. The rest is history. I can't even keep track of the flavors. They keep changing them so much. This is where food changed. The nutrients didn't change, the flavor changed. And I want to talk to you about the two ways that the flavor of our food has changed. And let's do that by unpacking the Dorito, by examining it. Let's start with that actual tortilla chip. Tortilla chips are made from corn, as we know. But the corn of the mid-1960s wasn't quite the same as the corn when the Frito company was started in the 30s. Yields had changed drastically. It was 27 bushels per acre in 1932, 80.1 in 1967. Today we're up to, well, it's even more than that now, but in 2014, 170. Orange yields, 176 boxes per acre in 1932, 328. Look at strawberries, 8,400 weight per acre, now 720. That's unbelievable. Tomatoes, 2,700 weight per acre in the 30s, 315 now. Now, there's something interesting about tomatoes and strawberries, which is that we can all agree that most of the time you buy these things in the supermarket, they taste like cardboard, right? We have this lingering sense, all of us, that food somehow went wrong. We are suspicious of it. We think that the people who grow it, the big growers, are in some way, they don't have our best interests at heart. Sometimes we think this is due to toxins and pesticides. Sometimes we think this is due to GMO. But we don't often really know. Well, someone asked an interesting question about that in the 90s. In the late 90s, a British researcher did a study saying that the nutrients in our crops had become diluted. And a woman at the magazine Organic Gardening sent a letter to the USDA saying, what is going on with our food? The nutrients are becoming depleted. She contacted the USDA and said, what did you think of my letter? And they said, what letter? They lost her letter. So she sent it again. But finally she got the USDA to respond, and the USDA said, there could be all sorts of reasons this is happening. There might be a bit more water in the modern produce. Our methods of analyzing it may have changed. There could have been more bird poop in the fields in the 1950s. We don't know, but the fact is, our produce is great. It doesn't matter. Get back to your business. They shrugged their shoulders. So did everyone else. And America merrily kept on eating its cardboard tomatoes and strawberries and high-yield corn and all the rest of it, except for a guy named Donald Davis. Donald Davis was a biochemist and nutritionist. He's still alive. He's retired now. In Texas, who worked at the institute that had discovered more vitamins than any other lab in the world. And he thought this was an interesting study, but he also thought there were problems with it. So he did his own study, meticulously comparing modern varieties of produce with 1950s varieties. And what he found is that there indeed were changes. He published them in a prestigious journal. His statistical methodology was exquisite. It's a paper that nobody can criticize. And here's what he found. Nutrients are down. In general, calcium's down by 16%. Iron 15. Look at the bottom, riboflavin, a B vitamin, down by 38%. Donald Davis became very interested in this. He spent a lot of time studying it. What he discovered is that a lot of horticulturalists had known about this for years. They called it the dilution effect. And he found there was two causes of it. The first was genetic, in that every time we selected plants that produced for their agronomic traits, things like yield, disease resistance, shelf life, we diverted their resources away from producing nutrients. We were saying, we just want you to be big, we just want you to have a thick skin, we just want you to fend off diseases, don't worry about the other stuff. And that's what they did. What he also found is that there's an environmental dilution effect, which is that the way we were raising these crops was diluting them. We were using much more irrigation, we were using much more fertilizer, we were getting a bigger crop, but it wasn't the same quality. There was a trade-off between quantity and quality. Well, you might be thinking that solves it, right? That tells us why those strawberries taste like cardboard and why those tomatoes taste like cardboard. But not quite, because there's a problem here. Nutrients don't, by and large, have any flavor. All those substances I mentioned right there are flavorless with the exception of vitamin C, which is sour. So really, if you look at that, you could basically say, well, produce got a little less sour over the last 50 years. Is that really such a big deal? To make you understand what happened to flavor, I want to tell you about a guy named Harry Klee. This is also a really, really interesting guy who I was very fortunate to come into contact with over the course of researching this book. In the late 1980s, Harry Klee was working for everybody's favorite company, Monsanto. He had been tasked with fixing what was wrong with tomatoes. Now, back then, everybody knew why tomatoes tasted like cardboard. It's because they were picked green. They were picked when they looked like Granny Smith apples. Those are not apples, those are tomatoes picked in Florida. They were sent to storage facilities like this, and then when they wanted them, they would fog them with ethylene gas. They would turn red, and they'd ship them to market. They looked good, they didn't taste good. So they thought, if we could just get a tomato to ripen more slowly, let's say 3 weeks instead of 1 week, we can let it ripen for 2 weeks on the vine, pick it, ship it to New York City, and we're going to have great tomatoes. The problem was no one knew how to do this. They'd been trying for a long time, they couldn't get it to happen, but Harry was a very bright guy. He knew that with GMO technology, you could slow down the ripening of a tomato. And that's what he did. He used genetic modification technology to insert the gene from a bacterium found in soil into a tomato to slow down the ripening, and it worked perfectly. In the early 90s, he walked out onto a test plot in Bonita Springs, Florida, and there were all these rows of tomato plants hung with tomatoes that had been slowly ripening for 2 weeks. A week later, he went to one of those storage facilities and pulled a slow ripening tomato out of a box, and it was red and luscious looking, and he sliced off a disc and he popped it in his mouth, and it tasted just a tiny bit better than a cardboard tomato. And what he realized then is that the tomatoes problem was a lot worse than just being picked green. So Harry quit Monsanto, he joined the faculty at the University of Florida, and he threw himself into tomatoes. He devoted the rest of his life to trying to figure out why some tomatoes were delicious and why so many tasted like cardboard. He grew hundreds and hundreds of varieties on a farm about an hour north of Gainesville, heirlooms, every kind of heirloom he could get his hands on. He would pick them, he would bring them to the University of Florida, and he would do 2 things with them. The first is that he would have sensory panelists taste the tomatoes, blind tastings. They didn't know what tomato they were tasting, they were just tasting a tomato, and they were giving it a flavor score. So he had this incredible database of sensory scores for tomatoes. He knew which tomatoes were delicious, which ones were awful. Most of them, by the way, are not very good. A very small percentage of them are absolutely incredible. But the other thing that Harry did is he analyzed them. He analyzed the flavor compounds, so he also had a database of the actual chemicals in a tomato. And by doing this, he could correlate which flavors were good and which ones didn't seem to matter. And what Harry Klee found is that the same thing was going on in tomatoes that had been going on with, the same thing had been going on with flavor that had been going on with nutrients. I want you to look, no, okay. Those 2 rows right there, concentration, you see the one that says Seraciform and then Florida Dade? Florida Dade is a modern tomato variety. That's a very old tomato variety. On the left, we have flavor compounds, and look at the differences. You can see the flavors are all lower in the modern one, 16.28 to 5.25, 27.21 to 17.15, 0.21 to 0.03. There has been flavor dilution just as there has been nutrient dilution. Well, who cares about flavor? Like I said earlier, if it tastes good, spit it out. Flavor's the thing getting us into this mess. We have never, ever talked about flavor. We talk about flavor when we're going to cook something delicious, but when it comes to the very important business of feeding ourselves what is healthy, flavor has nothing to do with it. So if flavor has nothing to do with it, why do things have flavor in the first place? Why are there these compounds in tomatoes, and why can we sense them? In fact, let's take a moment to look at that sensory apparatus. Who here thinks you taste stuff with your tongue? Nobody? I think that, okay. So flavor is a multimodal sense. That means there's lots of different pipelines of info getting into your brain, giving your brain information about food. And your tongue's a really important one. Your tongue is where your taste buds are, and they sense whether a food is sweet, salty, bitter, sour, or umami, which is like savory, like Parmesan cheese or Japanese broth or a great steak. But the tongue on its own isn't all that interesting. If you've ever had a cold and wondered why food tasted so bland, it's because your nose is plugged up. Your nose is the true master of flavor sensing. That is where the character comes from. It's called retronasal olfaction. We all think that we sense aroma with our nostrils, but the truth is we're even better at sensing aroma when those aroma compounds go up into the back of our throats. That's called retronasal olfaction. It is a more powerful, richer form of smelling. And when you chew food, your tongue senses the basic tastes, and your nose registers those aroma, and that's how we go, that's delicious, or that's just not very good. Well, here's the interesting thing about this flavor sensing equipment. This is chemical sensing, by the way. You are sensing chemicals. For everybody who's afraid of chemicals, We consume them all the time, and our body is awesome at sensing them. In fact, if you imagine your genome to be an instruction manual, the thickest chapter is actually on sensing flavor. The chapter on your nose and your mouth is bigger than the chapter on your brain, bigger than the chapter on your sex organs, than your eyeballs. It's really, really big. So from an evolutionary point of view, it must be there for a reason, right? Why would we have all these instructions to sense chemicals if it was useless? If something tastes good, you should spit it out. What's it doing there? Well, that's something else Harry Klee found out, because the thing we haven't looked at yet is this column a little bit to the left called precursor. Harry Klee found out that there's about, generally speaking, around 400 flavor compounds in tomatoes. And we tend to think, oh, that's amazing. There's so much richness. There's so many notes I'm getting. But what he found out is that the brain, our nose is capable of sensing the vast majority of them, but our brain just tunes a lot of it out. We aren't conscious of the fact that we are sensing so many of the flavor compounds in a tomato. There's about 20 flavor compounds in a tomato that drive our liking for tomato. If they're there in the right amounts, we go, wow, awesome tomato. If they're not there, we go, that tomato sucks. Well, one day Harry was at a meeting with a guy named Steve Goff, who's a cellular physiologist, and he talked about how tomatoes make one of their flavor compounds called phenylethanol. It's an aroma that smells like rose perfume. And he described this elaborate chain of enzymes that the tomato makes phenylethanol from, and it goes all the way to phenylalanine. And this guy, Steve Goff, said, that's kind of interesting, because phenylalanine is an essential amino acid, and it's actually a really important one. It's a really big one. It's a really metabolically expensive amino acid. It's kind of a valuable one. And he said, isn't that interesting that this aroma is made from this valuable essential amino acid? So then Steve Goff said, well, why don't we look at the other 19 important flavors from a tomato and see how they're made? And it turned out that every single one was made from an essential nutrient: omega-3s, omega-6s, essential amino acids, and carotenoids. So the flavor of a tomato is like a big chemical sign saying, come get me, I'm packed with nutrients. Our brain smells a tomato, it says, I don't care about the other stuff, I just want to know about these ones, because they're pointing to the nutrients that we need. So flavor is what you could call nutritional information. It is nature's language of nutrition, and it's there for a really good reason, because before we lived in cities and we had farms and supermarkets where you could buy food, we lived in forests where we didn't always know what we were eating. And we needed to have some means of sensing what was in food before we ate it. Because remember how I told you nutrients, you can't sense nutrients? We needed some means of figuring out what was in food before we ate it, by smelling it, and while we were eating it, by tasting it. And that's why we have this flavor sensing equipment, because it tells us what's in our food before it gets here. And if it tastes disgusting, we spit it out. And if it tastes good, we keep eating it. And all these flavors in the tomato are linked to essential nutrients. So let's talk about what happened with flavor, because that's the other thing about the Dorito. It's not just high-yield corn. It's that taco flavoring that made the Dorito what it is. And that is all thanks to this machine. It's called a gas chromatograph. The very first gas chromatograph went on sale in 1955. And this is the machine that finally let us figure out what flavors were. Before that, if you took something like an orange, we knew there was vitamins in oranges, we knew there was sugar, there were acids, but we didn't know what made an orange taste like an orange, because these substances existed in such small amounts, parts per million, sometimes parts per trillion. We just couldn't get our hands on them, literally. The gas chromatograph changed that. Now you could put a small amount of tomato juice or orange juice or a little bit of roast chicken. You could analyze it, and the flavor compounds came marching out the other end, and you could analyze those with a mass spectrometer, and suddenly we knew the chemicals that made our food delicious. Well, guess what? It wasn't very long before we figured out what those flavor compounds were that we started manufacturing them in factories that look like this. And it wasn't long after that that we started adding them to food, like this. If you look closely, you can see it right there. Flavorings, the last line. Those were these packets of chemicals designed by flavorists to imitate real food, produced in factories, and added to food like Doritos. That is the story of how our food has changed. And that is profound because when you think about the tomato, when you think about it in a state of nature, flavor is the chemical language of nutrition. Flavor is the sign saying, there's nutrients here. Look at what we did. We sliced those flavors off. We dissociated them from their nutrients, and now we put them in whatever we want. Nutritionally speaking, the taco-flavored Dorito and the corn-flavored, the regular, normal tortilla chip are exactly the same. It's this package of carbs and fat. When there's no flavoring, we think, well, that's okay. I'll eat a few of them. Maybe I'll dip them in real food like a bean dip or guacamole. But we add flavor chemicals, all of a sudden they become irresistible. But nutritionally speaking, they're the same. People started eating a really high-calorie food, lots of fat, lots of carbs, because it tasted more delicious than it deserved to. This is a food that packs a thrilling nutritional story, but it's a lie because it doesn't back it up with actual nutrients. That is what we have done to our food. We have created delicious food with no nutrition behind it, and that is why we eat so much of it. And not only that, we have robbed flavor from the very food we ought to be eating. So forget about nutrients for a moment and just think about the incentive to eat. We all want deliciousness. Well, deliciousness has evaporated from the produce section and from the meat counter, and it's gone to the packaged food section. I want you guys to ask yourself, of all these foods we shouldn't eat, if it wasn't for the flavorings, would we eat any of them? Think about soda for a moment. If you took a Coke or a Pepsi or a Mountain Dew, and you took away the flavorings, you would be left with a can of soda water that has 12 teaspoons of sugar in it. Would anybody drink that? Would kids drink cola if there was no flavoring in it? Think about potato chips. Would anybody eat potato chips if they all tasted like potato? I think they'd eat some. I don't think they'd eat nearly as many as they eat now. Think about Doritos. They flopped until they added flavoring, and then they became irresistible. Well, here's the story about flavoring. We're adding it to everything. This isn't just, my message isn't just that we have to stop eating junk food. My message is that we have to stop turning all food into junk food because we are adding flavoring to chicken nuggets. We're adding flavoring to soy milk. We're adding flavoring to frozen pizzas. We're adding flavorings to basically all fast food. We're adding flavorings to juices. We're adding flavorings to raw chicken and raw pork and raw beef because the people who make this stuff know it is so bland, you need to do something to it. We are incentivizing food to be delicious because we've robbed it of its natural essence. So the question is, what do we do about it? Because this is a pretty dire situation when the food that we should be eating is not appetizing, the food we shouldn't be eating is irresistible. So I want to get back to Harry Klee. And this is a tomato he developed. This is not genetically modified. A few years ago, he decided for an experiment he'd take his best performing heirloom, the heirloom tomato that everybody agreed was the most delicious, and he crossed it with a modern Florida variety called FLA 8059. It was a Maglia Rosa crossed with FLA 8059. Just think of that, this beautiful, rich-sounding name with an absolute agronomic powerhouse. And he was sort of hoping for a compromise. He thought, well, maybe I'll get a tomato, decent yield, decent disease resistance, decent flavor. What he got was a miracle tomato. The thing produced 20 pounds of tomatoes per plant, which is excellent, which is right up there with the very best varieties. Disease resistance was excellent, shelf life was good, but here's the most amazing part. The flavor of this tomato, its scores were indistinguishable from its heirloom parent. It is a miracle tomato. This tomato holds the promise that one day we can walk into supermarkets and buy tomatoes that actually taste like tomatoes. We can buy tomatoes that don't require a big glop of ranch dressing to be delicious. That's a healthier tomato. It's healthier because of what's in it. It's also healthier because you don't have to put crap on it. He created another one called the Garden Treasure, which is, again, FLA 8059 crossed with a German Queen, which is similar to a brandy wine. This is one of my favorite tomatoes I've ever eaten. I've gotten farmers to grow this up in Ontario, and it is mind-blowing. It's a tomato, it's like a really awesome steak where you're just kind of, you can't talk. This tomato is so awesome. I want to tell you about something else. Rutgers scarlet lettuce. This was developed by a guy at Rutgers University named Ilya Raskin, and he set out to improve lettuce. Lettuce isn't bad for you, but some people are critical of lettuce because it's not particularly nutrient dense. So Ilya Raskin thought, well, maybe I can make lettuce more nutrient dense. Maybe I can get rid of all these decades of nutrient dilution and make lettuce something that's really worth eating again. So what he did is he took a head of lettuce and put it in the blender. And then he started looking under a microscope for red-colored cells. Because in lettuce, the color red is associated with a family of plant compounds called polyphenols, which are considered healthy. And he found the red cells, he cultivated them into their own heads of lettuce, blitzed them again, cultivated the red ones, and in 3 generations, he had this. And this Rutgers scarlet lettuce has 2.5 times the polyphenol density of blueberries. And it's lettuce. And it costs maybe 25 or 50 cents more a bag than regular plain old boring lettuce. But here's what I love about Rutgers scarlet lettuce. Ilya Raskin set out to create a food that was more nutrient dense, and he created a food that is more flavorful. This lettuce doesn't taste like blueberries. It doesn't taste like radicchio or escarole or one of those really weird lettuces, which I like, but it just tastes a bit more lettucey. When you taste it on its own, you think, yeah, I'm getting flavor, but when you put it in a salad in the context with tomatoes and a great olive oil and a squeeze of lemon or a nice vinegar, it makes for an amazing salad. It teaches us once again that in nature, the relationship between the way a food tastes and what it brings to your body is inextricably linked. And that not only do we manipulate that at our peril, but we can get back. We can put back into food what we took away from it. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today, because you guys have been doing this for a long time. Grass-fed beef was always on the right track, because so much of that movement was inspired by an uneasy feeling that there's something wrong with the way we raise cattle today. Grass-fed beef is better for you, and it tastes great. So the message I would like to leave you with is that it's essential that we talk about flavor. When we have this food conversation, it's not just about omega-3s and vitamins, it's about flavor, because we are prisoners of our desires. We may think that we can eat what's healthy, but the truth is the vast, vast majority of us can't. We need to talk about flavor. You guys need to talk about flavor. You need to tell your customers, your distributors, that your beef tastes better because it's better for you. I personally find it more satisfying. One of the reasons I like grass-fed beef is I think it's more delicious, but I don't eat too much of it, and I don't get that feeling of unease half an hour later. Like I need those paddles to restart my heart, or I need to lie down for half an hour. But the other thing I would also tell you is that your beef has to taste good. There's still a lot of variability in quality in grass-fed beef. It's getting much better. But the story for grass-fed beef to get into the mainstream, and I think that's where we're getting now, we're moving beyond the time when grass-fed beef was a footnote to mainstream beef, when it was an alternative. It's now becoming a viable option. Sometimes this scares us. Some people get frightened by the fact that you might be able to buy grass-fed beef in all sorts of grocery stores. I think this is a great thing. But we need the flavor. If you want to capture the heart and the mind of the consumer, you do it through flavor. So flavor is the key to nutrition, and I think it's also the key to success for grass-fed beef. So again, thank you for having me. I love being here, and I would love to take any questions you might have if we have time.